Welcome back to the Grease Goblins Rereads channel. Today's video, we're going to be doing Catelyn 4, A Clash of Kings. One of the best follow-up chapters to my favorite chapter of the book, Renly's Peach. We see basically the conclusion of the Renly plotline with Catelyn. And it's a really somber chapter. It's a lot of kind of Catelyn reflecting on the events that has happened in the last chapter, how that's going to result, in the battle that's about to happen, and the war and how it's taking away her family and just the cruelness of war. So I really find this chapter to be really great. I think it's another underrated chapter for Catelyn in book 2 specifically, but let's not waste any time. Let's get into page 372 of Catelyn 4, A Clash of Kings. We start with Catelyn going to this village, or trying to go to this sept. The village is found after dark, abandoned and nameless, stripped of everything, even the candles in the sept. It just really shows how war has forced people to leave their homes, leave the places of comfort and peace, and how war has transformed these places into ghost towns. And this village, it kind of reflects what Arya saw, where Arya was seeing all these people leaving their homes, going south, all of those types of things. And even here you see that this village has been deserted. Now, it's not exactly made clear in this chapter if this village has been deserted because of the war, because at this point, the war hasn't really come to the Stormlands or the Reach at this point, where we're currently at. We're very close to Storm's End. The war really hasn't reached here. So I'd actually be more inclined to think that maybe this village had been abandoned previously at another one of these conflicts or wars, like maybe Robert's Rebellion, for instance. Very much unclear why these people maybe would leave their place, especially during the War of the Five Kings. Catelyn notes that the sept, once a holy place, is now cracked and crooked. Its religious icons replaced by rough charcoal drawings, symbolizing the collapse of order and kind of faith. I think this also kind of reinforced that this was probably not abandoned during the War of the Five Kings, the present war we're in. It was likely some other conflict that forced, people to leave their homes, similar to what we're seeing in the main story. Catelyn sees the familiar faces of the seven as they are all in a simple form: the father, mother, warrior, smith, maid, and crone, each sketched with their typical traits. For the seven, we have a good amount of idea of what the people believe in them to be, right? Being these figures of and aspects of life, but there's one that's very different, and that's the stranger. The stranger seems to implicate death and things of that nature, and it also reflects that, right? The stranger's face is different, an eerie black oval with stars for eyes, neither male nor female, making Catelyn uneasy. And I think it's interesting because you think about the fear of death. So many people have that. I think at some point or another in your life, you've thought about what comes after death, the fear of the unknown. And that's really perfectly placed here with the stranger. It's not something that you can draw an idea of. What is death? And I think that's really interesting because you think about how death can come to people in very different ways. Maybe it's old age, maybe it's sickness, maybe it's war, things like that. I think it's a really interesting way that George paints these different aspects of life. Catelyn then kneels before the mother, offering a heartfelt prayer, not just for her own sons, but for all the young men in battle, revealing, I think, a lot about her as a person, right? Caring about not only, her son who's at war, but all these other people that are at war. That's kind of what her last chapter, and really Catelyn 2 focus on a lot as well, is these Knights of Summer. They've never really experienced war. They don't know how horrible it is, how people will lose their fathers, their brothers, whatever. It's a horrible state. And so when you think about Catelyn, the way she's always preaching for peace and for these conflicts to be solved, it shows a lot of Catelyn's wisdom in terms of things like that. And I think that George really represents that well with having Catelyn go to the mother, because it's something that Catelyn's going to struggle with a lot throughout this book and the next book as well, is her being a mother. What should she do for her children? And whether that's trading Jaime for her daughters, or, learning the news of what's going to happen with Bran and Rickon. There's a lot here that is really set up well in Catelyn 4. But this is really showing that Catelyn, in a lot of ways, has felt like she's losing her stability. And the war has broken all sense of normality, right? You think about Ned is dead, right? That's something that's extremely important for her. This is the person she's probably leaned on for many years now at this point, someone she loved. And I think for anybody that questions Catelyn's love for Ned, I think this chapter kind of clears that up a lot. I know people like to bring up that Catelyn's so hateable and all this stuff, which is, again, I definitely understand why people don't like her. But I think when we get to this chapter, it's one of those where you can't help but feel bad for Catelyn. As we get to page 373, a crack down the mother's eye makes it look like she's crying. It also echoes Catelyn herself. Catelyn sees her grief in this drawing of the mother. And I think it's really interesting because you think about what Catelyn is going to set to be lost. Right now, she's not at the place that she's going to be. Yes, she's lost Ned. Yes, she's been gone from her sons for a while. And her daughters, one of them allegedly could be dead, hasn't been seen. And the other one is basically being tortured and is, been kidnapped. Sansa, she's being held hostage and she's being tortured by Joffrey. There's a lot that's on Catelyn's mind. And it starts to unravel some of Catelyn's grief, right? This is the first time that Catelyn has really been able to think about her feelings. She's been so, worried about this stuff with Renly and Stannis. It's been her main focus, keeping her away from her grief, but now it's starting to come out a little bit. Outside, Catelyn hears the knights talking quietly of the coming battle, but the stillness and silence around the sept deepen the sense of isolation. Catelyn is alone, and for once, she kind of lets her grief come in for only a little while. Catelyn wonders whether the old gods ever answered Ned, which I think is interesting because you think about what that says already. If Catelyn is wondering if Ned's gods ever answered him, it means she has some sort of doubt that maybe her gods are not the true gods. I think it's interesting the way that Catelyn is maybe going to change by the end of the story, and as Lady Stoneheart as a character, what does she believe in the gods, right? How would the new gods allow what happened to Catelyn's family happen? That's something that everybody thinks about. I remember when my grandfather died, there was a lot of questioning, especially I'm in a religious family. We're not people that are, Catholic or anything, but just general Christians. There's a lot of that where you have to question your beliefs. And I think with my grandfather, my grandmother, who had way more health issues, she was somebody that completely relied on my grandfather. It felt quite weird that, our grandfather was taken before our grandmother and all of that stuff. So there's just things that you think about when it comes to faith. And I think that George really reflects that in the writing really, really well. The flickering torchlight makes the drawn faces seem alive, ever-shifting symbols of how unstable and how uncertain everything feels around Catelyn. In the crude drawing, she sees things that she's thinking about, right? All these different faces, she's seeing the people she wants to see, the things that are on her mind. She sees her dying father. She sees Arya for even a moment. And it just tells her of all the memories and things that she misses that now that her family is fractured. A gust of wind erases these images, just as war and death have swept away the lives and roles that once gave Catelyn meaning. Catelyn is somebody that she's searching for meaning. She's searching for a place right now in the world because she doesn't know who she should be. She doesn't know if she should go back and be a mother to Bran and Rickon, who she hasn't seen in a long time, her youngest sons. Should she be with Robb, trying to help give him advice and all these things? Does she belong at war, right? She's been told numerous times by men that she shouldn't be in war. She doesn't know about these things. She has a mother's heart, and that makes her weak and all these different things. It's a lot of Catelyn trying to place where is she going to go with her life. But when she looks at the mother again, she sees her own mother, who died giving birth to a second son to Hoster Tully. It also just shows the tough situation that women are in this world, given the fact that we don't have great medical care. Majority of the time, women die from childbirth and all that stuff. It's a terrible thing. And this memory brings guilt, loss, and longing. She thinks about how different life might have been if it had been her mother who had lived. Which is interesting, right? Because if you think about it, if Hoster Tully had had a second heir, and, her mother had been around, would her mother have allowed what Hoster Tully did? Like Hoster Tully basically using Catelyn to get an alliance with Starks and having Lysa being a bargaining chip with the Arryns and all this stuff. Would we have actually seen maybe Catelyn's mother give her more a marriage that she wanted, right? Something that she was truly in love with. And that isn't to say that, she actually did like Brandon Stark. It was Ned that was the more political marriage. There wasn't any love between them, of course. There's always kind of that weird thing of Brandon being between them, but they did eventually start to love each other. Would that have gone differently if Catelyn's mother had lived? It's a very interesting question. Maybe something we'll have to tackle in another video. Catelyn again questions her purpose and choices, feeling she's lost her children's love, failed her husband, and wondered who she's even serving. And I think that's interesting because I think a lot of people that criticize Catelyn would be saying these exact things. She's not a great mother. Someone like Robb, for instance, she'll make mistakes like releasing Jaime that will get Robb killed. She is somebody that is not at Winterfell with Bran and Rickon. Maybe that situation goes very differently if Catelyn's there. I don't know how much differently that could have possibly gone, but maybe Catelyn could have been there for her sons, and obviously she would have known that they wouldn't have died. It's a lot of Catelyn kind of questioning things that she's done. Could she have changed things to allow this war to not have happened? Catelyn then thinks how she hasn't eaten, but the real hunger is not for food, it's emotional. Everything's starting to spill out. And if you're somebody that's ever been really anxious or really nervous or grief-stricken, I am somebody that tends to not eat at all. I don't like to eat. I don't feel hungry, right? When I am very anxious and very nervous, things like that. So I really relate to Catelyn here. Food would not be on my mind here. It would be more of that longing for, again, let's go back to my grandfather when he died. It would be the longing of wanting to have that person still be alive and for remembering all those things. And you think about what Catelyn's going through. She doesn't have anyone that she can really, at this point anyway, that she can get this grief out to. She has to play this strong, person. And I really, really sympathize with Catelyn because I feel that, especially when in those moments of grief and things like that with my grandfather's death, I was somebody that didn't really have the time to be able to express grief. I had to be the strong person for my mother, my aunt, whatever. I really relate to Catelyn. It's why I really love Catelyn's chapters, because they feel so personal and human that you can find, even if you don't like Catelyn as a person. I'm not, somebody that loves her as a person. I think she has a lot of flaws, and I think that she's I think she's a person that makes mistakes, and that's what makes her human. And so I really do enjoy that part of her character. But we even get one of the most heartbreaking lines in this chapter and in the book series as a whole. But she says, "Since Ned's death, they have killed me too." A part of Catelyn is gone forever. And I think that really strikes home with a lot of people. Me, myself, I haven't had a long relationship really to be able to relate to that, but I've seen it with other people and how they react to, especially when their loved one has died. My grandmother, my grandfather were together for, I believe it was upwards of 60 years. And you could tell that loss really hit my grandmother very hard, and she wasn't really the same afterwards. So it's a really tough situation, and it really brings back the humanizing side of Catelyn. The face on the wall becomes Lysa's, then Cersei's, and Catelyn reflects that even Cersei, her enemy, is still a mother. That she herself has had children, and she must love them through, giving up pain and blood and all this stuff for them to come into the world. In a lot of ways, it kind of shows Catelyn kind of empathizing with Cersei as well. Cersei's in a position where, yes, she made bad decisions. She's sleeping with Jaime, all this stuff. She had these kids, but Cersei is trying to protect her kids in a lot of ways. And so Catelyn's kind of seeing Cersei's actions through her own actions, that she would do anything for her kids. Cersei is similar in a way to that, even though it may be a bit more narcissistic than for Catelyn. But that gets us to page 374. Catelyn wonders if Cersei also prays to the mother, seeing her proud, beautiful features in the cracked wall, acknowledging that even Cersei can weep for her children, and even, praying and all that stuff. Cersei does not do much praying at all, so Catelyn might be off the mark a little bit on that sentence, but in terms of, Catelyn empathizing with Cersei, she's pretty correct. She recalls that each of the seven holds traits of the others. The mother can be just as fierce as the warrior when protecting her children. It kind of, in a lot of ways, is how it validates Catelyn's strength, right? Of her protection of her remaining children that she has and where they are with Robb and Bran and Rickon. It shows that strength that Catelyn is trying to show and trying to be. Catelyn then thinks on the revelation that Stannis had given to her, basically, that Joffrey, Tom, and Myrcella were all bastards. Catelyn reflects on Robert's lack of affection for Joffrey, and even how incest is condemned by both old and new gods, unlike the Targaryens, who follow different laws and customs. The Targaryens follow their own things from Valyria. They're viewed as higher beings, and if that started to diminish as the dragons went away and the Blackfire Rebellion, it's really started to diminish a bit, but that is the idea. So Catelyn is kind of realizing, she's kind of putting all the pieces together once she's got the final clue, right? Like, Catelyn has been told the information. She's now backtracking to try and see and validate if that is the case. Robert and Joffrey were never close. Joffrey doesn't look like Robert. Something was up, and that must have been what Ned and Jon Arryn figured out. She concludes that Ned and Jon Arryn must have known the truth of Joffrey's parentage, and that's why Cersei had them killed. And this is what's even more interesting. Catelyn realizes that in the same place, she might have done the same. But what's interesting here is actually Catelyn's quite wrong in terms of Ned and Jon Arryn's deaths. Yes, Jon Arryn was killed, but that was by her own sister and on Littlefinger's kind of orders. And then also, when you look at it from Ned's point of view, Ned was not killed by Cersei either. Ned was killed by Joffrey. So in a lot of ways, she's actually kind of wrong, even though you can understand why she thinks this way. She's actually wrong on both accounts, which I think is funny. But then the scars on her hands remind her of the assassin, and she connects it back to Bran, believing he must have seen or heard something, which is why someone tried to silence him, which makes complete sense. Catelyn is very wise here to understand that this assassin attacked Bran for a reason, but up to this point, they haven't figured out what the reason was. The reasoning makes sense. You want to kill Bran. But again, she's wrong. She still comes to the wrong conclusion, even though this is the conclusion I think most people would come to. It was actually more than likely Joffrey, or some people also think maybe it was Littlefinger. Either way, she's completely wrong again, but she is connecting the dots. She's understanding some of the rationale that maybe would have led to Bran being assassinated. Catelyn prays deeply and personally to each aspect of the Seven, seeking strength, protection, wisdom, and guidance for each of her children and for herself. She ends with the crone, asking for light and direction. It just shows her uncertainty. She doesn't know where she is to go. The world she's trying to navigate seems to be getting darker and darker. But at this, Sir Robar gently interrupts, and Catelyn rises weary and aching, but ready to return to duty. It just symbolizes that Catelyn has to throw away that grief. That grief has to go to the back of her mind. At the front of her mind, she needs all her wits, she needs her wisdom, she needs to be able to understand how to politically maneuver around these characters of Renly and Stannis. Her guilt has to wait. As they ride back to Renly's camp, the landscape and army are shrouded in darkness. Armor, banners, and faces are all hidden. It evokes this uncertainty of the coming battle, of how bleak the situation is, how Catelyn views this as just a folly. And when you think about it even more, this is really, I think, where you have the turning point of the Clash of Kings, right? Where we start to see the real story start to go on with Stannis and his journey to then getting to King's Landing. It's kind of that foreshadowing of the darkness that this book will then go on, right? Of what is coming, the darkness headed towards Renly Baratheon. As we get into page 375. Catelyn sees Renly's army as lifeless and colorless, gray men beneath gray banners. It just evokes this sense of like doom, like this is this terrible event that's going to happen, which is really George's best ways of foreshadowing the events to come. She rides through a forest of knights, lances, and she also kind of combines this as saying like they are like dead trees. And she keeps going towards a deeper darkness. Storm's End, which is obscured completely, it kind of has this ominous threat of Stannis building up to this shadow that looms over Renly's camp. Renly's pavilion grows with an otherworldly green light, making it look like a magical castle. The color casts a sickly hue on his knight's armor and banners. It just shows you that Renly is this opposite version of Stannis, right? Stannis is the kind of the darkness, the bleakness. Renly is this beacon of light. He loves all of these fancy things, and that is represented perfectly here as the shadow creeps in. Inside, Brienne is suiting Renly up in dark green armor, gleaming with golden highlights, described like a king of summer woods. Yet this kind of seems to be almost like an illusion, right? Renly being dressed up as this rich king and all of this stuff. And in reality, he will never see the battlefield. And also, the battle is kind of interesting from Renly's point of view. Renly really isn't going to do much of this battle anyway. Like, there's no real chance he'll die in the battle. So it's, I don't know. It's a lot of like for the illusion of power. Catelyn respectfully calls him Your Grace, something she has never done up to this point, telling us, the audience, she's really trying to persuade Renly. But Renly prioritizes what is going on with the military planning over her warning. Renly knows exactly what Catelyn's going to say. And Renly just doesn't want to hear it, right? Renly is already steadfast. They're going to do this battle. The plans have been drawn up. There's no chance for peace anymore. He doesn't want to kind of hear Catelyn talking to him like she is his mother. Lord Rowan and Tarly advise Renly to strike early, but Renly insists on waiting until dawn, concerned with honor and appearances. He refuses to seem treacherous, even if it gives Stannis the advantage. Again, it's all about the prospect of power and how you hold yourself. And I don't even fault Renly for this. Renly has the overwhelming forces. He has all the advantages. There's no reason to necessarily do this sneak attack if you don't need to. But at the same time, you got to be thinking in the back of your mind. Stannis is one of the best military generals in Westeros. What is he planning? There has to be something here. It's the same idea of the phrase going after Stannis in book 5, or I guess the beginning of book 6, same idea, right? There's got to be something up Stannis' sleeve. And so if you're, Lords Rowan and Tarly, you see that. You understand war isn't about being noble. It's about winning the war and taking it out as quickly as you possibly can. Taking him in the night where they will have the advantage is a very good strategy. And so whereas I can understand both sides, I do think Lord Rowan and Tarly are correct. They discuss the likely outcome. Renly believes Sir Loras will break Stannis' lines, followed by chaos. His confidence feels excessive, maybe even a bit too much. And I talked about this already. I mean, Stannis just doesn't have the numbers. He doesn't have the quality of men that Renly has. I don't really fault Renly for being overconfident. He should be overconfident. Now, if this is how he was acting against Tywin, who is a much larger force than Stannis, I would be a bit worried. But here, I mean, if Stannis doesn't do some voodoo magic, Renly is probably right. They're going to win. Renly instructs his men to treat Stannis' body with respect if he falls. It does show a bit of honor towards his brother, even though they may have their quarrels. Renly doesn't want Stannis to be paraded around, and be disrespected and all of that stuff. It shows a respect for Stannis and maybe even a care for him that has, up to this point, not yet been the case. When asked if Stannis might surrender, the idea is openly mocked. Stannis would never surrender. I mean, through all these chapters, that's obviously what we've gotten from this. Stannis is somebody that will not break. He may bend, but he will not break. You either are going to kill him, there is no surrender. And that even brings up the idea of the Siege of Storm's End. We get back to what Stannis was going through. Stannis once ate rats rather than yield. It proved his pride and unbending will. Stannis is somebody that you have to force to be broken. He can't be bent. As we get into page 376, Renly recalls the Siege of Storm's End. Now, he was much younger at this point. He recalls Sir Gawain Wild, hopefully that's how you say that, probably not though, as he had tried to surrender. But Stannis had caught him before they could surrender, and Renly claims Stannis wanted to catapult them from the walls. As you remember seeing Sir Wild being put in the catapult and seeing the fear in his eyes. But this is not what actually happened. Lord Rowan doubts this, and Renly clarifies it didn't actually happen, but Stannis was somebody that wanted to do that. But he was talked down by Cresson, which is interesting because Cresson is this character that felt like Stannis' true father and the father of Renly. He was the one trying to promote peace and all these different things. And unfortunately, Cresson dies in Stannis' service to Melisandre. But here you see what Cresson had, his influence over Stannis. Now, Cresson knew how to, I don't want to say manipulate Stannis, but how to get him to see the better path. But it gets even darker. You think that, oh, well, I mean, this can't get any worse. The reason Stannis does not send them over the walls in a catapult is because Stannis didn't want to waste the bodies. Due to starvation fears, they may have to eat the dead at some point. What does that remind you of? That reminds you of A Dance with Dragons, where we see that there's cannibalism going on in Stannis' camp. A very interesting parallel. There's a lot of great world building, great character building in Catelyn 4. But besides the point, Sir Gawain Wild died in prison anyway, so the tale didn't go that well for him. Catelyn presses Renly for the promised word, and he dismisses his lords, but asks that Sir Barristan Selmy be spared if found. He respects the old knight's loyalty. Renly notes that, again, we haven't seen Barristan. We don't know where Barristan is, and if Catelyn is telling the truth, well, he's not with Robb. Where else can he be? He's not with Robb. He's not with Renly. He obviously is not with Joffrey. That means he has to be with Stannis, right? That's the theory at this point, and honestly it would make sense. Stannis is the rightful heir. Once alone, Catelyn tells Renly that she believes Jaime and Cersei pushed Bran because he saw them in incest. She asks permission to go to Stannis and share her suspicions to unite the Baratheon brothers and Robb Stark against the Lannisters. But here's the problem. Yes, this might be interesting news for Renly, but it doesn't matter, right? Like, this information is nothing new. What is this information going to tell? Oh, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are all bastards. We already knew that. They did these horrible crimes against House Stark. They've already done that. This is really, in a lot of ways, like Catelyn's just adding to the reasons they should hate the Lannisters, but it doesn't have any type of news that would tie them together. And then she also suggests something that I do think would be interesting. She proposes that there should be a great council to choose a rightful ruler, promising Robb would step down if the others do. Which I just don't know if this would be the case. If there was a great council called, I could see Robb laying down his sword. Here's the problem, though. If Robb does that, Robb loses all respect from his northern lords. He loses almost all of his credibility right then and there because the North wants to break away from the South. It's not that they're also trying to avenge Ned. They don't want to be under the Seven Kingdoms anymore, right? So it's not that simple. And even with Stannis and Renly, why would they do that? Stannis believes he's the rightful heir. There's no reason to call a great council if you're Stannis. For Renly, maybe there is a reason because Renly is somebody that has the popularity. Renly would win that easily, right? So for Renly, what does he have to gain, right? Because Stannis isn't going to do it. He's not going to accept that. Robb probably isn't going to do it. Like, it just doesn't make much sense. Like, I think it's a great idea for Catelyn in a perfect scenario, but it's something that's just not feasible. And Renly scoffs at this, mocking the idea with a metaphor. Do direwolves vote on who should lead the pack? But I do think that's a bad reference. Wolves and people are very different. I get what he's trying to say, but in reality, this should be kind of the way things are done, voting on who you think should represent you and things like that. But it also tells you something else that's very interesting. Remember, Renly's claim to the throne is on popularity. Renly basically is becoming the king because of this. People are voting to back him and all that stuff. It's kind of in a lot of ways hypocritical, in my opinion, that he kind of scoffs at this idea. Brienne then brings Renly's regal battle gear, an antlered helm and gold-stitched cloak, and it completes the image of really Renly trying to be like this more bright Robert. So that's how I view Renly right now, that Renly is like going for the look-alike factor with Robert, of course, but also with the Tyrell twist to it. As we get into page 377, Renly continues gearing up for battle, putting on his green and gold armor while Brienne helped him despite Catelyn's urgent request to speak. And at this, suddenly a strong gust of wind blew open the tent door, and Catelyn noticed something odd about Renly's shadow. It seemed to be moving strangely. And again, you can understand this, right? Renly's shadow, probably because there's a lot of lights in his tent, all that stuff. This is not Renly's shadow, and it seems to move not naturally. Before anyone could react, an invisible, shadow-like blade pierced Renly's throat, even though his real sword remained sheathed. At this, Catelyn has to know, this isn't Renly's shadow. This is some sort of magic. Something is being done. And in one basically quick moment, Renly will die. Renly gasped in surprise. Blood poured from his throat, and he collapsed into Brienne's arms, who screamed out in horror and grief. And this will end the life of Renly Baratheon, the king who could have been, but was undone by magic. Stannis, his own brother, killing him in the middle of the night. The torchlight flickered and some candles went out as the dark moment unfolded. From the screaming that they heard from Brienne, Sir Robar Royce and Sir Emmon Coy, I believe, rushed in with men-at-arms, and upon seeing Brienne holding the bleeding king, Sir Emmon shouted that she was the killer and raised his battle axe to attack her, which has to be the case. If you are these men, you come into this scene, you see that Renly's dead, in Brienne's arms. Obviously, it was not Catelyn. That just makes the most amount of sense. Who else could it be? Brienne, this person that everybody already, makes fun of. She's a woman in the Rainbow Guard, all this stuff. People even might be jealous of her. It might even confirm that she is distrustful, right? That we shouldn't have trusted her in the first place. And instantly, they blame her. Sir Robar was shocked and called out to Brienne, confused and horrified. Catelyn Stark finally found her voice and screamed for them to stop, but the knights ignored her and rushed towards Brienne, fueled by anger and fear. They didn't hear Catelyn. When you're in this bloodlust, you've seen a king that you love is dead now, you're not going to hear Catelyn, right? There's no words that are going to solve this situation. As we get into page 3, 78. Brienne reacted with surprising speed, grabbing Renly's sword since her own wasn't nearby. She blocked Sir Emond's axe with a loud clash, then struck the axe handle, sending the head flying. A man holding a flaming torch attacked her, but her blood-soaked rainbow cloak didn't catch fire. Brienne fought fearlessly, knocking the torch away and cutting down the attacker's hand. Despite being outnumbered, she managed to keep both attackers at bay, even as Renly's head rolled on the ground and blood continued to flow slowly from his body. This king that had been all about the pleasantries of life and talked about how you should live life to its fullest, his life is cut short. It really is foreshadowed a lot in Renly's Peaches chapter, talking about, having peaches whenever they're available. You never know what could happen the next day. Something I think is really wise of Renly, even though I think Renly takes that to the extreme. It does have a very sound message. People can die whenever, right? You could, I hope not, you're watching this video, I hope not, but you never know when life ends. And that's the key to it, is you just try to balance your life to a point where you have a good life. So yeah, that should be the moral of the story with Renly, but let's continue on. Sir Robar hesitated but started reaching for his sword, but then Catelyn grabbed his arm and urged him to listen. Robar and Catelyn had a previous encounter in her last chapter, and Robar is willing to listen. Catelyn insisted Brienne was innocent and claimed Stannis was responsible, explaining the shadow assassin and the dark magic involved. Sir Robar was still not fully convinced, but he was accepting what Catelyn was saying, trying to think about it, and Robar was then convinced by Catelyn, who then promised on her honor and all of those things, and Robar promised to hold the attackers so Brienne could escape. A valiant action by Robar, and unfortunately for Robar Royce, we know he doesn't have a happy ending. He doesn't have much of a life after this point, as he'll be killed by Sir Loras. It is a horrifying, thing, right? Robar makes the honorable decision, right? He protects Brienne, who's someone who is innocent, and he loses his life for it. It's one of those things that I think is completely forgotten about in A Song of Ice and Fire. So I want to give a Robar a little bit of a shout out, give a little bit of a mention to him, as I think he's a very interesting character. For the very few amount of times we see him, he goes out, I think, in a pretty honorable way, something that we don't see a lot with knights. The fire spread along the tent wall as Sir Aemon pressed hard against Brienne, but Catelyn struck Aemon with a heavy iron brazier, knocking him to his knees. Not killing him, because Aemon will also be killed by Sir Loras, but Catelyn ordered Brienne to flee with her. They slipped out into the cold dawn quietly, avoiding running to prevent raising suspicion. And I think if you're somebody that understands who Brienne is, she loved her king, it was obvious to see. Why would she kill Renly? And that's the thing I think you have to think about if you're looking at Brienne. It's something we're going to see with Brienne and Loras as we get further into the series with like Jaime and Loras and all that stuff. It is really fascinating to understand, right? Because if you're somebody that sees Brienne holding the king and all this stuff, the idea is probably that, yeah, Brienne killed him because maybe she confessed her love to Renly and Renly denied her, and so Brienne killed him for that, but that just doesn't seem feasible. I think that's what a lot of people would come up with, but if you knew Brienne, you knew that it was not true. Catelyn ordered Brienne to flee with her. They slipped out into the cold dawn, quietly avoiding running to prevent raising suspicion. Something that I really like that the show did. I do like to give the show its flowers when I think it improves or makes scenes better. I really like in the show how Brienne is overcome by her emotion, and she doesn't use her brain in the show. Whereas in the show, Brienne is like, she won't leave Renly. She loved him, all this stuff, and she's kind of has to be convinced to leave. In the book, it's a lot more like Brienne understands the situation, and she leaves with Catelyn. I really like both versions, of course, but I think the show really did a great job of taking this scene and really making it amazing in the show. Just wanted to give a shout out to that as well. And again, the books don't necessarily need it as much because eventually we're going to get Brienne POV, so we'll understand her POV a lot better as we go forward. But I find that something I really do love about the show versus the book. Getting into page 379, Brienne quickly secures Renly's sword and joins Catelyn as they navigate this chaotic camp. The king has just been killed, there's a fire starting and all this stuff, and that's what Brienne and Catelyn see. They see the king's pavilion engulfed in flames, men shouting of fire, murder, and sorcery, and some pray or weep. Renly's forces are falling apart as rumors spread. Dawn reveals Storm's End shrouded in mist like mourning ghosts. A lot of these men will die in this war, and a lot of these men have they don't even know it, and this is what Catelyn thinks, is that they've already switched sides. Who can they back now? Renly, their king, is dead. A lot of them, especially the Stormlander forces, will move to Stannis. And Stannis orchestrates this perfectly. Regardless of what you want to think of Stannis, he does it in a way that doesn't bring suspicion necessarily to him. Like, yes, he is one of the candidates, but most people think it was Brienne, or maybe that Catelyn was involved. He does a great job of taking those forces and then giving them to himself. Brienne now starts to be able to mourn Renly's sudden death, struggling to understand what even happened. Catelyn reveals she saw a shadow, which she believes was Stannis's, implying some sort of dark sorcery. Filled with loyalty and anger, Brienne vows to kill Stannis with Renly's sword. Something that we don't really think is going to actually happen in the books, because if this is going to happen, you got to remember, Brienne's still in the Riverlands. Stannis would actually have to survive in the story for a much longer period for this to occur. So I actually don't think Brienne will actually be able to kill Stannis unless he's maybe made a prisoner or something like that. But I do find it highly unlikely that she does kill Stannis. Their escort waits with horses. Sir Wendell Manderly is shocked by Brienne's bloodied appearance. You've got to be thinking, why did Brienne show up with Catelyn? And we're hearing that the king might have died or all this stuff. Why is she here? And what is Catelyn's involvement? That's another thing I would be thinking. Catelyn confirms Renly's death wasn't their doing and says there will be no battle now. She orders Brienne to leave her armor and horse behind and flee quietly with the escort to avoid suspicion. They mount and ride on with orders to kill anyone who tries to stop them, just telling you really the severity of the situation and how they might have to cut their way through to get back up north. As we get into page 380, Dawn reveals the army's banners and lances, once Renly's, now completely under Stannis' control. Though unaware, the troops have effectively shifted allegiance to Stannis after his deadly strike. And Stannis does this perfectly with Melisandre, and we know it's going to work. So, a really awful thing Stannis had to do, killing his own brother, but he does get what he wanted, his ability to gain men to take the Iron Throne. Then this gets something else sparking in Catelyn's mind. If we go back to Catelyn 3, Stannis was pretty cold to her as well, and even named Robb a traitor, and that his time will come as well. Catelyn now thinks about her son, that Stannis may now think of her son as being the next target of his sorcery. It's a dark way to end the chapter. It's a really impactful chapter. It's one of the best of the book. And it just tells you how the war is now shaping up now. What will happen with the Tyrell forces? What will happen with Stannis now that he has all these men? Will he go for King's Landing? How will that affect Tyrion and all those other characters? Where will Catelyn go from here, right? She's kind of at a crossroads. What's she going to do? What's her influence of the war going to be? And this is only going to rise the worry that she has for her children. If Stannis takes the city, what happens to her daughter? Yes, Stannis might have promised something to her, but Stannis also just killed his own brother. Great way to end the chapter. I really hope you guys enjoyed Catelyn 4, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.